Hello and welcome to The Signal, Workplace NL's health and safety podcast. Workplace NL is the Workers' Compensation Board in Newfoundland and Labrador, Canada. The focus is to promote safe and healthy workplaces, provide return-to-work programs, and offer compensation to injured workers and their dependents. This series of podcasts will provide you with the latest information on how workplaces can protect the health and safety of workers. Please enjoy the show.
So it's hard to believe that the CSA Standard for Psychological Health and Safety was published over a decade ago. It certainly has been a topic of conversation here in Newfoundland, as well as Canada and other countries and jurisdictions right across the world. We are seeing the needle move forward on progressive actions, standards, and regulations to support the psychological well being of workers. The work that is being done is leading to new and emerging best practices in the field. Today, I'm joined by Cathy Barrett-Brinson, Senior Health and Safety Advisor, and Jordan Friesen, Founder and Principal Consultant of Mindset Mental Health Strategy, to talk more about what psychological health and safety is, what's currently happening in the field, and what the future holds. We're also going to talk about challenges that workplaces may be facing, and we're going to end off with touching on ways to accommodate workers who have psychological injuries. So, welcome, Cathy.
Good day, DeeAnne. I'm so glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
And welcome, Jordan, all the way from Winnipeg,
All the way
Manitoba.
from Winnipeg, the one place in Canada that perhaps gets colder than the Rock in January.
Absolutely.
Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
I am so glad that both of you could join me today to have this really important conversation that's happening in many, many workplaces in the province for sure. So let's begin, Jordan. I am going to start by asking you, so how has the topic of psychological health and safety evolved in Canada over the last decade or so?
Well, in some ways it's changed a lot, and in some ways it's perhaps stayed the same. And so maybe I can start with what stayed the same, and then from my view go into what's changed. And I think what stayed the same in Canada over the last decade or so is I think the North Star that for a lot of organizations is that national standard.
Right.
It was one of the first of its kind, or the first of its kind in the world.
Yeah.
And this was back in 2013. It was used to develop an ISO guideline a number of years ago as well. So it has some international influence. And I would say in Canada, certainly in the health and safety and psychological health and safety world, it's still looked to as a gold standard, albeit a somewhat aspirational gold standard that still is in practice hard for organizations to fully achieve and implement. I mean, like any health and safety management system, it's multifaceted. It requires time, investment, and real intention to truly implement in the fullest sense. So that's stayed a relatively consistent North Star in the field. Whether people are talking about it explicitly as much is maybe one of the things that's changed. I remember back when I started in the field of workplace mental health, which was 2015, so a little while after that standard came out. And a lot of the conversation from employers focused on implementing the standard, focused on, in particular, those 13 factors that I know we've all heard a lot about. I would say the shift that I've seen in Canada, the language that's being used now is more around alignment with the national standard. So not necessarily around full implementation, but recognizing for employers, how can we shift our people management systems to better align with the practices and principles that are identified in that standard, as well as less explicit conversation about those 13 factors, which, when you were to talk about the national standard a decade ago, really most people would just jump to thinking about the 13 factors, or even I would hear people calling it the 13 standards, for example, right? And so that's shifted a little bit as well, in that I think there's some recognition that that list of 13 factors was a helpful checklist or a laundry list of potential things to pay attention to in a workplace, but having gone through that COVID pandemic that we'd all rather forget, realizing that the range of psychosocial hazards in the workplace is really quite broad and ever evolving. So I think that in itself is a positive change. We've got more openness to understanding what are the specific factors unique to our workplace or our work context, as well as, I think a more realistic application of what it means to use the standard as a tool. I like to think of it as a practitioner that the standard is kind of like an underlying theory and framework that I need to know, that I can help guide organizations and companies towards some degree of alignment with. They don't necessarily need to know it in great gory detail, but it's sort of the signpost in the back of my mind as I help organizations sort of shift their systems and people systems one degree at a time. Yeah. So that's in general, I think, how I've seen the conversation change. But I know the two of you have been embedded in this issue in Newfoundland for a while. I mean, anything else that you've seen change in a local context? I'd be interested to hear too.
I definitely think there's a lot of interest amongst workplaces, employees, and employers that are really interested in knowing more about what it is to be a psychologically healthy and safe workplace. I think we've seen a real increase in the interest, and obviously we know that it's beneficial to all parties, so it's understandable that it increase is has been seen in workplaces. And we know that many employers right now are interested in creating that psychologically healthy and safe workplace because they want to mitigate hazards like burnout or excessive stress, absenteeism, all those kind of things. So it's interesting to talk about how Canada has evolved in that way. Are we ahead? Are we behind? What are we seeing other countries and other jurisdictions do? Where should we be looking to see maybe where we should move in and what direction we should move in?
Yeah, no, a really good question, actually. And it's something that I try to pay pretty close attention to. And there's, from my work in the past in mental health in Canada, there's, I think, an old adage or saying, or at least a belief that if we want to see what's happening in Canada on the mental health front in about 10 years, look to what's happening in Australia right now. And so a lot of actually best practices in mental health care, service delivery, health promotion have emerged in Canada from Australia. I'd love to say that Canada is always leading the way on this front. It's not always the case. I think, interestingly, in Australia over the last year and a half or so, they've actually passed a lot of legislation and regulations around psychological health and safety. And so employers in, I believe now, every province of Australia or state in Australia have a legal requirement to assess for and develop controls to manage psychosocial risks in the work environment. So it's actually legislated now. Employers that fail to do that and injury results from it do end up facing fairly significant fines. And so that's, I think, one thing that I would point to that, may or may not happen in Canada. But if I look at sort of who's leading the charge on this issue in really concrete ways, Australia, having put it down into legislation and regulation, I'd say would be at the top of my list.
Okay.
And I think and a lot of people have asked, from the Canadian perspective, will that national standard ever be made mandatory across the workforce? In its current state, I'm not entirely sure that's likely to happen. In particular, because it's a large document. There's a lot of requirements in the standard. To make all of that mandatory, I think would put a fairly undue burden on a lot of organizations and businesses, especially small businesses in Canada. But I think the piece that Australia has really leaned into is this notion of having a system to identify and mitigate risk, which is, of course, the core of our national standard as well. And that's what they've chosen to make mandatory. So I could see a future in 5 to 10 years where something like that happens in Canada. I think a lot of that depends on the prevailing winds, certainly from a political perspective, around where that goes. The other country that I point to, and again, with the caveat that this may lose steam over the next 4 years, would be our counterparts down in the US, and in particular, the Surgeon General. That released a number of guidelines, and one in particular around mental health and well-being in the workplace. And this is not to the level of a standard, so to speak, but I think gives a really useful framework for organizations to think about what creates a mentally healthy workplace and what helps people thrive at work. So we have the standard in Canada and the approach in Australia, which is around risk mitigation. And then we have really interesting and thoughtful leadership from the Surgeon General in the US that talks about health promotion in the workplace. And so those, I think, are really two great examples of countries that are maybe just slightly ahead of the curve compared to where we are in Canada, and maybe things that we could be looking at in terms of where we might want to go with the issue in our country. Those are the two that come to my mind. There's other stuff in the EU around implementing rights to disconnect. There's been a little bit of that in Canada as well, in particular in Ontario, but I think other provinces too. Those have limited efficacy, those regulations and the legislation, but certainly I think are getting more traction in the EU in particular, and France especially, where there's a very strong labor movement. And so those are a couple examples, I think, of other countries, what they're doing, and some that are, I think, pushing the envelope maybe a little bit further than Canada has over the last decade.
Yeah. So as I'm listening to you, I guess what comes to mind is that there really is no right way for an employer to move forward to improve upon psychological health and safety in their organization. It really comes down to the workplace, the workers, the culture. However, in hearing you speak about what's going on, I guess, in the rest of the world, there are some, I guess, common themes that are throughout: risk mitigation, health promotion, specific procedures and policies to help workers, well, I guess to prevent psychological harm to workers. So, what are some common best practices that you suggest or recommend to organizations in improving the mental health of workers and reducing the risk of psychological harm?
Great question. And best practice is still somewhat murky in this particular field. And again, I think, as you mentioned, DeeAnne, it's hard when every workplace is a little bit unique. And the idea of best practice or evidence-based practice is that we have an intervention or a change that we're able to study many times over in a very similar environment and reproduce the same result. Now, that gets really tricky for researchers anyway, when they think about doing that in work environments, because work is always changing, and people are always changing, and the environment is always changing. So best practices are certainly harder to nail down in work environments, but that's I think a few that are very easy to agree on and support. The first one comes from the World Health Organization, and they released some guidelines for workplace mental health. I believe this was in 2022 or 23, probably 23. And one of the very few interventions or recommendations that they could make with a sufficient amount of evidence and a sufficient degree of reassurance that it would make a positive change is training for managers and people leaders. And so that's one in particular that I would say is across the board almost unequivocally supported and universally helpful in every workplace. That education can consist of a few things, and there's lots of different programs in Canada to educate people leaders on this topic. I don't endorse any particular one, but in particular, leaders benefit from understanding what mental health is, how the work environment can influence mental health, good, bad, or otherwise, signs to indicate somebody might be struggling with a mental health challenge or a mental illness, and then how to respond appropriately in the work environment. And so those are really the key things that any manager training program needs to cover. That's, I'd say, a well-established best practice within organizations. I'd say the other best practice within organizations gets into, I think, DeeAnne, what you were saying around all of them being unique and that there's risks that every employer needs to figure out and tackle. And I would summarize that best practice as effective and responsive employee listening. And I think this comes down to how we really identify psychosocial risk. In that psychosocial risk has a large element that is perceptual on the side of employees, right? As a leader or a business owner or a manager, I could say from my perspective that the work environment is psychologically or psychosocially very safe. But at the end of the day, the risk is kind of determined by the person that's exposed to it. So organizations that are really doing well in creating that mentally healthy workplace are finding creative and flexible ways to listen and respond to the needs and concerns of employees on the ground on a regular basis. And this goes beyond the once a year employee engagement survey or the every other year psychosocial risk assessment survey. This goes down into almost a day-to-day dialogue with employees and giving line managers the right tools to have a conversation with people about their work experience. How are you experiencing work right now? What's working for you? What isn't? What impact is that having on you, on your ability to be productive here at work? And what can we do to change it? So essentially empowering leaders to ask the right questions and to listen and make really micro changes on the day-to-day or week-to-week that are going to actually support the well-being of their people and in almost real time try to mitigate some of the risks that are coming down the pipe.
Yeah, I really like those two suggestions. I think they'll be really helpful to the employers that are listening to the podcast today. And I think there's a lot of things they can take and build on from there. One of the things that I do hear from employers, which I think they feel is maybe a sensitive issue or something that they fear they would handle inappropriately or and not in the best way, which they wouldn't want to do, is how to accommodate an employee who may be dealing with a psychological injury, whether that be from inside the caused by the workplace or outside of the workplace, or a mental health issue. And again, employers find that maybe a little bit challenging and a little bit of a sensitive thing to deal with.
And it's sensitive not just from the how do I actually accommodate someone that needs it, but even how do I have that conversation with someone. I think I can say that over the last 5 years, I've been doing this work exclusively. It's probably the thing I've spent the most time doing is helping leaders find ways to appropriately, sensitively, and with a degree of care, have a conversation with someone that's struggling and find a pathway to support for them. So a couple things that I think make it easier. Number one is for leaders focusing on the observable impacts of a psychological issue in the workplace. And I use the example of an executive years ago that I spoke with. And this was after I shared my experience of when I was younger, living with or dealing with a depressive episode in the work environment. And so I shared what that was like for me. And this leader, asked afterwards, and can you tell me more about depression, for example? I feel like if I understood what that was, I'd be better able to spot it and be better able to have conversations with people who might be struggling with it. And I, sort of delved through all the clinical indicators of what depression is. I guess the pitfall that managers often fall into is that they need to apply some label to what they see going on. And they don't. They just need to be attuned to the changes in behavior in the work environment that are having an impact on work. And so this could be anything from how we relate to others to the number of mistakes we're making on the job, to the ways we're expressing ourselves that might be different from what you understand to be normal for someone. And all of those things are ideally things that you can, in a reasonable work environment, provide feedback. And so for managers and leaders, if you're concerned about how do I have this conversation with someone that I think is actually really struggling, what do I need to lead in with? You need to think about the changes that you've noticed that would be appropriate for you to provide feedback on in any other context in the work environment. And that's how you know you're on pretty safe and appropriate ground. And then from an accommodation perspective, I like to talk about big A accommodation and little a accommodation. Big A accommodation is what we know as the sort of formal HR process of accommodating an employee who's disclosed a health condition or a health-related disability in the workplace. And every organization has a duty to do that and accommodate those folks. I would also say, though, that every organization can benefit from little a accommodation, which would be providing individualized ways of working that meet the needs of employees at different points along the continuum of mental health and well-being. And a lot of that comes down to changes in management behavior or management practice, is what I'd like to say, is that often some of the most helpful things for employees when they're struggling with their mental health. Maybe they're experiencing stress because they're a caregiver, or perhaps they're having difficulty focusing, for example, and maybe not to the point where they have a doctor applying some diagnostic label to that experience, right? And that's a lot of us, to be quite fair, right? 1 in 5 Canadians will experience a mental health condition. That's closer to 1 in 4 now, every year. But every single one of us over the course of a year will find ourselves at some point where we're less mentally healthy than we'd like to be. And so being attuned to those changes in your people and finding small A accommodations to support them would be, I think, a really helpful best practice. And those could be anything from more flexibility, more regular feedback, could be changes in how you communicate, more structure in your communication, for example. Those are all really helpful ways to support people sooner rather than later. From an accommodation perspective, and Cathy, maybe you can elaborate more. I mean, the biggest concerns I hear are around, what exactly is my obligation? How far does that obligation extend? And this argument around what undue hardship is, and what does that look like from a mental health perspective? Those are the 2 most common challenges I hear, but are they different from what you hear, Cathy, on the ground in Newfoundland?
I think that's pretty much what we're hearing. And also just, coming up with those practical solutions, which I think that you just really summarized really well, that it can be as easy as changing the way you communicate. It can be, being flexible where you can. Not all employers have the ability to have flexible schedules, but there's always opportunities, I think, for an employer to find a way to provide the employee with autonomy in how they schedule their day or how they schedule their breaks or that kind of thing. So I think a lot of it is just, like you said, just really working with the employee. And I love the idea of the little A's because I think that's less
Yeah.
overwhelming for not only the employer, but also with the employee as well. So I really like the way
Yeah,
you framed that up.
I think the automatic knee-jerk reaction for employers and even for employees when there's a mental health issue that's causing a challenge at work is that we need to separate this employee from work, right?
Yes.
It's stress leave, time away, right? Like that's, I think, the accommodation that is most quickly jumped to on both sides of the table. But it's often the least helpful. Now, certainly when employees are acutely ill or when they are in the midst of grieving, obviously it makes sense, right? When they're simply incapable of doing any aspect of their job because they're struggling so much or they're so ill, obviously they need time away from work to do the things that they need to do to feel better. And that is, I would say, on one end of the accommodation spectrum, right, is absence. And that is, in fact, a form of accommodation, right? But there's so much between being healthy and productive at work and being off work. And I think exploring the area in between that is where there's real value for employers and for managers, and it has to be a two-way dialogue. But where it starts, I think, is being able to have a more informed discussion about the tasks at work that are most challenging and why. And we would do this exact thing for someone with a broken leg or a sprained wrist, right? We would take a look critically at their job. We would look at the physical demands of their job and identify in the context of their injury, what are the things that are easy to do, hard to do, simply can't be done, or need to be done in a different way. And we can actually apply that same logic to mental health challenges or illnesses.
Yeah.
But instead of strength or endurance or flexibility, it's things like focus and memory and concentration and recall and conflict management and interpersonal interactions. Like, those are the different variables we need to consider. I think a great resource that I often point people to is called Supporting Employee Success. So, Supporting Employee Success, it's from Workplace Strategies for Mental Health. And it's a great tool that actually kind of gives a breakdown of the different types of job demands that might be impacted by a mental health issue or a mental illness. And I think that forms a stronger basis for figuring out what those accommodations are, because the undue hardship argument for a mental health condition is very hard to make, with the exception of, I think, very small businesses, because the only two arguments you can lean on are health and safety and financial burden. And when the average cost of quote unquote accommodating a mental health condition in the workplace is, so this is from the Mental Health Commission now, probably close to 10 years ago, but at the time it was less than $750. Even factoring in our outrageous rates of inflation these days, it's still a pretty hard argument to make on the financial basis. So there is a significant obligation for employers, but I think we often interpret that obligation as bigger than it needs to be, right? That my obligation is that someone can be off work or take as much time off work as they need to from now until the end of time. And again, there's a lot of gray in between being at work and helping productive and being away from work. And employers and employees need to work together to find that middle zone, those small A accommodations day to day that can actually really make a huge difference.
Yeah, like Cathy, I really love that small a analogy as well. But what I really like about the small a is that as opposed to the big A, the small a is directed more towards the individual. What can we do for you as an individual to accommodate you so you do remain healthy, safe, productive? I think that when you look at it through that lens, it's more of a relationship, I guess, and a conversation, a more productive conversation between the leader and the employee, where they're actually working together as a team to keep the worker in the workplace and to remain productive and to contribute to the organization, to their work, to their family, or whatnot. So I really, really love that, and I'm going to steal that from you.
Please do. Go ahead. I didn't make it up. This is from a lovely individual named Lynette, who used to work for CMHA in BC. And she gave me the concept of big A and little a. The other thing I'll say is that this has massive impact on employee retention as well. And I know we talked about some of the challenges that employers are facing, and some of them are related to mental health, but in general, they're facing large challenges getting and keeping good people. And there's a little bit of analysis that's been done by the Canadian Human Rights Commission, specifically around providing individualized forms of accommodation for employees with any sort of health-related disability. And again, that could be a permanent health-related disability, permanent mental health condition, or chronic mental health condition, or an episodic mental health condition, like a depressive episode or a period of burnout, for example. And what they found is that 70% of employees who receive that individualized level of accommodation are far more likely to stick with an employer that's provided it to them. And so, that's one small subset, but I think it's easy to extrapolate. And what we know about our youngest generation of workers is that if we're going to treat them like individuals and give them the individual support or the individual sort of management that they need, that they're way more likely to stick around. And that's a huge advantage for employers that are willing to go that extra mile, and that they'll be able to keep their people and solve one of, I think, the biggest challenges that they're facing right now.
Absolutely. And that's definitely something employers are looking for ways to do that, to keep their employees.
So I guess we'll finish up with, what do you think, Jordan, is the future of psychological health and safety in Canada? and as well, I guess, going beyond, because you know what? We are living in a global village, aren't we? And we do
Hmm.
know that we are using, best practices. We're using evidence from all jurisdictions. So
Hmm.
where do you see us going from 2025 and beyond?
Oh, well, if I had a crystal ball, this is where I'd whip it out, Kathy and DeeAnne. I think in the short term, so I'll take it sort of short term and then longer term. Short term, I think what we're going to likely see is perhaps a little bit of what's happening on the DEI front in the US, and may have a similar flavor in Canada. Um, it's sort of pulling back from some of these more progressive social issues that we're trying to make an impact on through and for the workplace. And so what that means, I think, is that a lot of employers over the last 10 years have been supporting psychological health and safety or mental health because they've inherently felt that it was the right thing to do. And I've got no issue with that, because I do in fact think it is the right thing to do, no matter the direction of sort of political or economic winds. But I think to continue making the case, a large number of employers that currently are feeling really passionate about this issue are going to have to focus a little bit more on tying it into their business objectives to make it stick. And so when I talk about a mental health strategy for an organization, it rarely exists as something discrete and on its own, right? Like, I think what employers need to be thinking about is, how does this concretely tie into our turnover metrics? How does this concretely tie into our productivity or output? How can we measure that and make those correlations so that not just that it's the right thing to do, but we actually have some strong business evidence to support continuing to work in this way and support our people in this way. So I think short term, what we're likely going to see is an increased need for organizations and even health and safety professionals or people professionals to do that, because there hasn't necessarily been a need to for organizations that have just wanted to do it because it is the right thing. So I suspect that will change a little bit. But long term, I do think this notion of mitigating, at least identifying and then mitigating psychosocial risk in the workplace, is one that will eventually roll its way into Canada. Just given the environment that we have with the labor movement in Canada, given, I think, the overwhelming evidence that exists around how work can in fact be harmful for your mental health, I don't see any way that we're not going to get there in Canada. So I would look to our colleagues in Australia to say that it's the way the winds are going to blow at some point or another here as well. And so I think for employers, maybe looking at that standard, and certainly it's still helpful and important, but I think the more you can lean into finding effective ways to listen to your employees and figure out what those risks are, I think that'll put you at a huge advantage over the next 5 to 10 years, not just from getting ahead of the legislative curve, but I think also because it is exactly what employees are going to be looking for in employers of choice going forward.
Thanks so much.
Absolutely.
This has been such a helpful conversation. I think everyone that tunes in to listen to it will definitely get something from it that they can use and be inspired by in their workplace and in their journey to becoming more psychologically healthy and safe in their environments. I just want to thank you, myself, Jordan, for all the work that you put into educating employers. As you said, you've been working in the space since 2015, and I know you've made a huge impact. And we just want to thank you so much for being a leader in this space and for joining us today.
Of course, happy to be here, and looking forward to the next time I get out to the Rock.
Thank you for joining us today. Transcripts are available to use in your workplace to increase workers' knowledge in various occupational health and safety topics. Visit workplacenl.ca for more information on the services we provide to workplaces. Feel free to share the signal on social media to improve workplace health and safety everywhere. Thank you, and have a safe and healthy day.